Now recording. My name is David Levi Vogel. Nice to have you with us, and to us today, one of my mentors, Professor David Vogel from the Haas School of Business in Berkeley, University of California. And hope you will enjoy the webinar. Thank you, David, for joining us. And I admire your energy. And here is another book to the dozen books that you already produce. Is it dozen or only 10?
I think this is the ninth.
This is the ninth. And I know
Yes.
the 10th is on his way. He's working on it. We just had a chat before the recording. And today we are going to speak about his latest book, which just came out. And this is, I guess, the first time that he's presented it after the publication. This is a book was written with Roger Karapin. I hope I pronounced well. And the title is When Federal Climate Policy Works. So I guess from the title that this is a story of success. And this is a success on a number of policy area under climate policy. And but instead of me telling you about what is the book about, I will just give the floor to David. Thank you so much, David, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. There is a large literature on American climate change policy, and it's basically a story of failures. Cap and trade failed, no carbon tax, BTU failed, the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Accord, neither have been ratified, and renewable energy mandates have failed. So there's a huge literature which explains why describes and explains these policy failures. We have decided to focus on a different angle, and we try to explain and describe policy successes. Now, I want to make it clear that we are not suggesting in any way that these policy successes adequately compensate for the policy failures, that they in any way add up to an effective response to the risks of climate change. Nonetheless, we think they're important for several reasons. Several are less well known. We also think that they do have substantial accomplishments which need to be recognized and appreciated, which are the world is better off with had these policies not been adopted. And most importantly, we think that the focusing on policy successes and explaining what it is possible to happen provides a future roadmap for explaining the parameters, providing a framework for what actually can happen in the future. So we think that basically we're presenting what we think is a moderately optimistic projection as to under what conditions the federal government has been and may continue in the future to enact effective climate change policies. So, David, would you put up the list of all these policies? Okay. Does everyone see them? No? Okay. So, anyway,
אתה על השטק, דוד.
See, okay, let me put it up. Just a minute. I will start with this slide, which presents the book. You see the cover of the book.
No, the one with all the lists.
Yeah, just a minute.
The next one.
And this is the list.
Yes. Okay. So we list here several policies. These policies focus on renewable energy, automobile emission standards, appliance standards, chemicals, and methane. And when I want to mention these policies, unlike the policy failures, these policies are very narrowly focused. They're all sectoral policies, which do not affect the entire economy. And that's an important reason why they were able to succeed. Secondly, it's important to note that with the notable exception of the methane releases on oil and gas production, none of them address the fossil fuel industry. None of them seek to limit fossil fuel production. And even the methane standards seeks to regulate one particular pollutant from fossil fuel production and not the production itself. So we think that the fact that they're sectoral policies, they're narrow and focused, that they don't directly limit fossil fuel production is an important reason why they have been successful. And these policies also have a very long history, a history which in many cases predates the science of climate policies. Vehicle emission standards began in 1975. The chemical regulations began in 76. Renewable energy in 78. The Energy Star was enacted in 92, appliances in 87. All these policies took place and were initiated largely before climate change became highly salient. And even in the case of the methane standards, the landfill methane in 96 and oil and gas production in 2012, they began not as climate change policies, but as policies dealing with health. So we argue that these policies have a long history, and in many cases, their origin predates the science of climate change. And actually, in every single case, their origin has nothing to do whatsoever with climate change. So our argument is that there are three reasons which has enabled these policies to happen. One is they produce non-climate benefits, and I will give you a few examples. Secondly, because they're narrowly and focused, they have been able to be enacted in a way that has been broadly acceptable, even benefiting the particular sectors that have been regulated. And thirdly, we discuss the role of partisan politics. So let me begin with the issue of non-climate benefits. One of the most important non-climate benefits is public health. So if you think back to the ozone depletion policies, these were policies designed to protect people against skin cancer. The earlier methane regulations were designed also on public health. So let me just say a word on the ozone standards. So in the late of the 70s and 80s, the United States and the world enacted the Montreal Protocol, which attempted to restrict ozone depleting chemicals. This was a policy completely limited and focused on public health. But it turns out, and this was one of the most surprising things we found in our research, that those chemicals, in addition to endangering public health, also turned out to be very potent climate change greenhouse gas impacts. Particularly, they reduced photosynthesis, which in turn meant that plants were going to have less capacity to protect carbon. And indeed, the Montreal Protocol, although having nothing to do with climate change, turns out to be, in retrospect, the most effective climate change reduction policy ever enacted, and a policy which has had enormous impacts. Indeed, its impacts on climate change were 5 times as great as those of the initial round of Kyoto, even though these policies had nothing to do with climate change. And our argument is they were enacted because they provided benefits other than climate change. A second reason non-climate benefit has to do with saving energy. Renewable energy policies in the United States, policies which auto emission standards were all designed to reduce American dependence on imported oil. And again, they had an impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but that was not why they were enacted. So the second big reason is saving energy. The third is these policies save people money. That's most dramatic in the case of appliance standards. In 2024, American households saved $105 billion in energy costs because the appliances they used were more efficient, roughly about $600 a household a year. So these policies, again, had non-climate benefits, which included health. They saved energy, and they saved consumers money. So those were three important non-climate benefits which were enacted. So the second dimension has to do with the business benefits. And so let me just tell you a quick story. So on appliances, when the appliance standards were initiated in the early 70s, the appliance industry was very, very opposed to them. They thought, let the market decide. And for 20 years, they were able to effectively resist any national appliance efficiency standards. However, in the early mid-1970s, California began to enact appliance efficiency standards, beginning with refrigerators, the appliance in the household that uses the most energy. These proved very effective. It turns out that they were not more expensive than the less efficient refrigerators. And California then began to enact a long list of appliance standards for household appliances. Other states realized that this was a way of saving energy and saving consumers money, and they also enacted to adopt appliance efficiency standards. Once about 20 states had adopted these policies, the appliance industry panicked and changed its position. And they said, we're now willing to support federal standards. And the package worked out was, we will now have federal standards, which were enacted in 1987, provided there's preemption, which meant that once the federal government has regulated an appliance, no state can then regulate that appliance. But until the federal government has regulated an appliance, states can do so. So the logic for the appliance opponent of efficiency proponents was this: other states like California will continue to enact appliance efficiency standards. The industry will then turn to the federal government and strengthen federal standards. And so that's been the dynamic in which the role of federalism, and that's true in other policies, has also played an important role in changing industry preferences and making industry more willing to support federal regulations. A second example has to do with chemicals. So it turns out that the ozone depleting chemicals, which had a dramatic impact on reducing carbon emissions and protecting public health, they were substituted by another chemical called HFCs. And it turned out that HFCs, although they protected the ozone layer, also turned out to be very effective and unsafe greenhouse gases. So we solved one problem and created another. And the federal government began to move to phase out HFCs. And this turned out to be a very effective policy. There were many substitutes available. The chemical industry was happy to move towards other chemicals. And it turns out that in refrigeration and in refrigeration and air conditioning, there were other substitutes which were even more efficient. So what was really striking is that the industry very, very quickly, voluntarily and in supporting federal standards, moved away from HFCs towards other chemicals. And again, this was an important climate change policy. Industry supported it, not because they cared about climate change, but because these chemicals were more efficient and more available. And most importantly, in 2016, the world enacted the Kyoto Protocol, which was an amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which said that any country which has not ratified and restricted HFCs could not export its products to their country. This meant, of course, that the huge market in air conditioning and refrigeration, which was increasing ironically because of climate change, would be excluded by American exporters. So the one reason why U.S. policy moved to adopt these policies was because of the business benefits of making American export policies possible. So that's another example of a policy, a climate change policy, which was enacted with the support of particular sectors, namely the refrigeration and air conditioning sector and the chemical industry, which benefited from these policies. Another example is, which probably is the most dramatic, is Energy Star. Energy Star has proved to be among the most effective climate change reduction policies enacted by the United States. And Energy Star has been strongly backed by business. 3,000 companies either produce Energy Star products or market them. There are roughly 80,000 products in the United States which are Energy Star certified, okay? And this is very, very important. So Energy Star is a great example because Energy Star has nothing to do on the surface with climate. It's about saving consumers money and creating business opportunities. But it also turns out to have a climate change benefit. And what's interesting about Energy Star is that it has been strongly backed by appliance manufacturers. And when the first Trump administration tried to end federal funding of Energy Star, the industry went crazy and the government retreated. And if you look at all the climate change retreats enacted by the Trump administration, the current administration, what stands out is Energy Star is not among them. And it was led by a huge industry, led by General Electric, which pressured the federal government to keep funding Energy Star, not because GE cares about the climate, but because it made them money. And again, that's an important part of the story. If you look at methane restrictions, that's a very controversial area. But the global methane industry has agreed and moved towards restrict methane emissions. Now, just to give you some background, so when natural gas is burnt, uses energy, it emits relatively few carbon emissions, CO2 emissions. But when natural gas is flared into the air, it's all methane. And that's very dangerous both for public health and for the climate. So basically, if you think about it from the point of view of a natural gas producer, when methane is released in the air or just flared and burned and not sold, it increases carbon emissions and loses the industry money. So in the long term, the oil and gas industry has an incentive to reduce the amount of methane emissions so they can take the natural gas and sell it and make money. In 2023, the global energy firms all got together and agreed over time to reduce their methane emissions. Methane emissions have been going down steadily per barrel of oil. Okay, the American Petroleum Association has also backed methane emission restrictions. And again, one reason, there are a few other reasons also. The natural gas industry wants natural gas to be seen as a clean transition fuel. And therefore, getting rid of the methane emissions helps their reputation to keep it as a clean energy source. And most importantly, several European governments have restricted American exports of natural gas unless they can certify that the natural gas is produced in ways that reduce methane emissions. So for all these reasons, the global gas and oil industry has had good incentives. It saves them money, it reduces waste, it improves their reputation, it increases their access to global markets. And for all these reasons, the oil and gas industry has been supportive of the methane restrictions on the whole. Okay, so those are a few examples of business benefits in these policies. Now, there are exceptions. For example, the appliance industry had no problem with more energy efficient appliances or with Energy Star. But when the Biden administration began to restrict gas-fired appliances in the home, stoves, furnaces, and water heaters, the natural gas industry, of course, was very opposed to that because it directly burdened them. And they restricted and they stopped those policies. It's also the case that when the auto emission standards began and restricting gasoline use, the oil and gas industry had no problem, but when electric cars emerged, which directly reduce and limit, of course, gasoline production, they became very opposed to them. And also on the methane emissions, the industry has been very divided. With the big, large multinational oil and gas companies have the technology and the way of detecting methane emissions and reducing them. If you're a small oil producer, the natural gas, you want to burn it off. You have no way of accessing it, no pipelines. And the smaller oil companies have been very opposed to the methane restriction. So that's been, again, an industry division. And finally, when it comes to the Inflation Reduction Acts included a tax on methane emissions, and that the entire industry was opposed to, and the very first regulation rescinded by the Trump administration was getting rid of the tax. So those are a few giving a glimmer of the sense that in each of these policies, there were important politically popular non-climate benefits which were enacted. And even as these policies became linked to climate change, those non-climate benefits and the policies framework adopted in the earlier period create a policy framework that has persisted. So, for example, on appliances, the basic structure was established in 87, and even now, of course, that remains the basic federal law governing appliance efficiency standards. Now, there's also been a shift. So the last time Congress enacted renewable energy policies, appliance or auto efficiency standards was 2007. Since then, they become partisan just by presidential administration. Renewable energy, last time Congress enacted was 2015. Again, they become partisan. The one exception is the chemical policies. And in 2021, Congress enacted restrictions on HFCs. The vote was 359 to 53 in the House, 92 to 6 in the Senate. So this was a policy enacted quite recently with substantial Republican support. And when the Kyoto Protocol was proposed by Congress to be enacted by President Biden, it was passed by the Senate 2022 by 69 to 27. What explains this unprecedented Republican support in Congress for a climate policy? And the reason is not because they cared about the climate, but because there were substantial business benefits to this policy. And the industry supported these policies. And because it has strong industry backing, many Republicans were willing to go along with them. Okay, so well, let me just go to the last slide for a second to think about the future of what some of these lessons, which I think are worthwhile. Can you show? Okay,
Yes.
so
You're there.
okay. So these are some examples of policies which we think, which some guidelines. So I want to begin with. They show that the role of states has a very important policy, is very important. They show that even though these policies were earlier enacted, all of them have potential to grow. Appliances have gotten steadily more efficient. There's no reason why they can't get more efficient in the future. We think that the key to climate change policies is to not focus on climate change, maybe not even mention climate change, but to talk about other popular non-climate public benefits which people are willing to support, and climate change becomes a happy byproduct. We also think that the focus should be on reducing the demand for fossil fuels, not the supply of fossil fuels. Because if you go after the supply of fossil fuels, the fossil fuel industry will veto the policy, and climate change and fossil fuel industry in America continues to have a veto over climate change policies. So these policies need to be enacted in ways that do not directly burden or affect fossil fuel producers, but there are ways of reducing carbon emissions which do not do so. And again, also, we think that the role of state policies is very important. Finally, let me say about consumers. Consumers seem to be unwilling to make any sacrifices when it comes to the climate. They'll do things on public health, but not on climate. And so, for example, if a policy burdens consumers, they will rebel. So they're fine with Energy Star. They're fine with appliance efficiency standards. But when it comes to reducing household appliances that are run on gas, there's a norm which it produces about 7% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. come from household. People are very opposed to do that. The light bulb standards, which were first enacted in 2007, they took into 2023 before the technology made it feasible possible to enact light bulbs. And so we think, and it's interesting, if you think about the methane restrictions and the HFC restrictions, they've been invisible to consumers. They haven't raised their costs. No one is even aware of them. And that's, we think, very important for these policies. When the public believes that a climate reduction policy disadvantages them, changes the cars they have to drive, changes the kind of appliances they want to use, change the kind of light bulbs they don't like. When those things happen, the public will rebel. So we think one important lesson of these policies is they should be enacted in ways that either benefit consumers or do not burden them. And at best, if these policies are enacted behind their back, actually, and they're not even aware of them. So I think, though, in each of these policies, in each of the 6 areas we identified, there are substantial rooms for improvement. So this is not just a static policy. These aren't just static policies. Each of those 6 policy areas can be strengthened, but they need to be strengthened in ways that are careful. Let me give one final example, okay? The major source of methane emissions in the United States is now from farm animals, from agriculture. 36% of U.S. methane emissions now come from agriculture, not from landfills, not from oil and gas production. That has been an area which no politician in the United States has dreamed of addressing. That's been off the agenda, clearly. And the reason is, of course, you have a powerful farm lobby, which is going to oppose any restrictions. And you also have consumers who would be burdened by such policies. If someday we're able to develop new technologies of agricultural production, and there's research on this, that will enable farm animals to be produced in ways that will also not burden consumers and be acceptable to farmers, we may then restrict methane emissions from agriculture. But to date, only one country has done so, namely Denmark, and that's mostly because it produces pigs, which produce much less methane than do cows. So again, we think that there's technologies that can work on these policies, but they need to be structured in a way that either is invisible to consumers or do not burden them. Because I think the evidence is pretty clear. When you label a policy climate change, it's hard for people to accept it. if you label policies focusing on non-climate benefits that also have climate benefits, you have a much better chance of adopting them. So let me stop there.
Thank you so much, David. Let me put myself also on the screen.
Okay.
And we'll open the floor for discussion, the virtual floor that we have here. Any comments, questions, just come in. I do have some questions, but I want to give opportunities to others.
Okay.
Anyone wants to start? Julian, I had this feeling that you would want to react, please.
Okay, thank you, David. Thank you very much for the presentation of the book. I haven't had the chance to read it yet, but I have seen
By
it.
the way,
It is in
let
the
me
public
just say
domain. So
just let me add one point. The book is now available online free.
yeah, I saw that.
It's open access for MIT Press.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. So I look forward to reading it. I just wanted to react to something you said on the final recommendations you were making on how to make climate policy successful in the future. So, for example, making sure they're not painful to consumers. And very clearly, this comes from a detailed reading of the social obstacles to these changes and political obstacles to these changes, special interests and so on. So that's very, very clear. I am also a social scientist, but I tend to read a lot of the climate science stuff nowadays to try to educate myself. And it's striking that these recommendations, if I may, it seem to be clashing massively with what the climate scientists community will say, which is that physically there are considerable that's really referring to physics there, but there are recent papers, for example, on planetary boundaries, which will look at what would happen if the Paris Agreement was implemented nowadays. And they would say, well, actually, we would still be in a very, very dire situation because this wouldn't bring us back to where we need to be in order to be safe. And in a world where the policies that are put forward are not painful, it seems that we are even further from that safe space. So how do you sort of think about this clash, if I may put it this way, between the social scientists' perspective on this and the climate scientists' perspective on this?
I completely agree with you. I don't think that these policies are adequate, and I think you could look at our research and say this is depressing. This is disappointing. It shows that even these policies, which are it shows that only very limited effective policies can be enacted. I think it's true. I think that's right. I think that it's completely true that these policies demonstrate the limits of what can be accomplished, and I think that's deplorable. But I think that's the real world we live in. I agree. I completely agree. I'm not pretending that we have unlocked the solution to addressing climate change. On the contrary, we recognize these are real constraints. These are limited constraints, but we think that the focus on these broad policies, climate reduction policies like the Paris Accord, which explicitly link to climate, we think those policies are not politically viable. We think this is the best we can do. Is it good enough? No, but we think it's better than nothing.
Yeah, is it a US constraints, or to what extent your conclusions apply to, say, the rest of the world, say Europe? No,
I think they do. I think there's been a big backlash. I know on heat pumps, for example, in Germany, there've been big backlash in France on their climate change reduction policies. I think that they apply. We didn't look at other countries, but I do think they apply more generally. I think that a lot of countries in the world are now rolling back their policies because they're politically unpopular, they're not affordable, et cetera. So So I think the details are going to vary by country, but I think that our broad, might argue, our broadly pessimistic or cautious view of what can happen in climate change, I think, is consistent with what is going on in other countries.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the answer. Francois, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, my question was actually quite similar to Julien's one. And I was thinking also more now like as a comment, as an example of where you reverse the causality basically between the evidence, I would say, who is like the cause of the problem and who is then the target of political action, which is the financing of political parties, where we tend to regulate the not the parties themselves, but like the donors, and this is kind of a policy where we try to control a bit the amount of financial flows that are going in, but in the end it just goes beyond what actually the political compromise is willing to give. And I was thinking now about, in the same logic of reversing this causality about agriculture, would it mean that you would like recommend, for example, to give, for example, food bonds for consumers in order for them to give them the ability to choose maybe more sustainable food products and thus steer agricultural production towards a more sustainable or climate compatible way?
I think that that's not going to have a big impact. I think, if you think about consumers, when you advertise a product that's healthier, that benefits them personally, they're, organic, whatever, they're willing to buy it. They like Energy Star not because they care about the climate, but because it saves them money. I think that I would be skeptical that you would have a big impact if you began to label products by their climate impact. I mean, that would be, dairy products and all beef. You'd have to label. Could you imagine a company which would manage to market and produce those products in ways that reduce their carbon emissions as possible? I think that's a long haul. I think that's possible. There could be a niche market, but I would not be optimistic that that would have a major impact on consumers.
Well, as you mentioned labeling, if I may just compliment a bit on this, the labeling process is in fact quite contested by the agro industry. They oppose they'd be for health reasons or other aspects. But if we not target the consumers in the sense of subsidizing their purchase, this would be like it would support the consumers in making their choices that may be then more climate friendly.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, broadly speaking, this is a generalization. People are willing to make sacrifices, pay higher prices, or indeed, more pollution standards automobiles if it directly affects their public health, their health or public health. But when it comes to the climate, it's very tricky because the links between the consumption and the broad global climate are very tenuous. So I think that it's hard to get people to enact in ways which are purely climate change motivated.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Marcus, please.
Thanks. Yeah, that was interesting. I was also going to ask the question that David asked about what's happening in other parts of the world, where he answered that from the World Health Organization to declare climate as an international health hazard. I wondered, thinking of them, is some of your findings in the US?
I mean, I think that, if you look at the survey data, on how salient climate change issues among the issues people care about, it's very, very low. It's very low. It's not a highly salient issue. I don't think it's an area where people are willing to make sacrifices. I think there are real limits to it. Just doesn't resonate. It's too abstract. We could read about health and issues and increased heat, et cetera. There's no question that there's negative health impacts on greenhouse gas emissions, but I don't think they resonate sufficiently to get policymakers to address them. I mean, I think that if you want to get policymakers to address them, you need to also link these policies to non-climate benefits. That's our argument.
Thank
They
you.
shouldn't be standalone.
Mathieu? Mathieu, please. Okay, so let me ask a question. What would be the counterfactual or example for your analysis? Meaning, can you identify the areas, policy areas or countries where the argument will not hold?
I mean, it's beyond our scope. We did not look at any other country other than the U.S. So I can't speak to that authoritatively.
Yeah, but I was wondering because you mentioned labeling as something that you wouldn't recommend, but many people would see climate change as a problem, and there is environmental social movement and climate change constituency, which are perceptive to those arguments, including eating beef and so on. They might not be the majority, but they still effective, might be effective.
I mean, I think some of those things can have a modest impact. But again, I think, take, for example, buying an electric car. Electric cars have a big positive impact on reducing carbon emissions. But people don't buy electric cars because they care about the climate. They buy it because they have other benefits. And I think, the restriction and I think the slowdown in electric car purchasing, electric vehicles, a lot of these mandates in the US are not going to happen because basically, the cars have various reasons why they're still not attractive enough. So I think you have to be careful about enacting policies that consumers are not willing to accept. And I think the amount of policies, pure climate policies, are much rougher sell than policies which have non-climate benefits, which are popular. I mean, that's our argument.
Yeah. So in a sense, you are saying people, but you don't accept the argument that there are different types of people, and people are acting on different motivations.
I don't think there's enough support for those different motivations to have a substantial impact.
Yeah,
I think they're a fringe.
I see. Julian, please. And then Mathieu, I don't know if you want or not, but Julian.
I think
Ronit
Ronit has tried to.
Ronit, is your hand up?
Yeah, Julian, please go.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think Ronit has tried to come. Yeah, Ronit, go.
David, you've mentioned several European countries that refuse to buy methane from the United States.
Right.
Which countries exactly?
The European Union has enacted policies which in the long term will restrict imports And there are a number of private European countries which have done this. This has become a contentious issue. The Trump administration has been very opposed to these policies. But the EU basically has said, we have restricted methane emissions from our oil and gas production. And unless those similar restrictions are imposed on producers that export to Europe, we will not allow them. But it's being phased in gradually.
And I was wondering whether in each of the cases there was a difference between the first Trump administration to the second Trump administration in terms
Yes,
of
yes. Yeah, I mean, we haven't, I mean, we have looked at that. And it's interesting if you look at all the rollbacks for the second Trump administration, there's been a lot of rollbacks on renewable energy, on automobiles, less on appliances, not on Energy Star, and on chemicals and methane. They've relaxed some standards, but the industry has said very clearly, we will continue to enact our restrictions, even if the standards are relaxed and not enforced. So in two of the areas, as well as an Energy Star, these policies remain resilient, or the business practices remain resilient, not because they care about the regulations, but because these policies actually financially benefit these companies. That has enabled them to survive the Trump administration rollbacks. I mean, there's been a little pushback on the chemicals from some of the big supermarkets have, had to change their refrigeration, and some of the companies that produce the energy storage companies and et cetera. But it's been pretty modest. So, and the oil and gas industry has said we will continue to reduce our methane emissions regardless of what the law says.
Thank you.
Thank
Yes.
you. Marcus, Matthias, please, did you want to ask?
Yes, sorry, I didn't manage to unmute myself before.
Please, go on.
Thank you very much for your talk, David. That's fascinating. And I was also wondering if you could elaborate more on the federal dynamics, because this features in the title of your book, but you haven't really addressed it that much in your talk. So I was wondering about that, and also about whether you would have some lessons to share with what can be done in other federal contexts.
Yeah, I think I didn't emphasize that enough in the talk, but I think the federal role is very important. It was critical in appliance standards. In the case of the chemical restrictions, there was also the fact that California adopted policies first and people thought they were feasible, and there's a limited preemption on those policies. The oil and gas industry supported federal standards because it didn't want to diversion state standards. So I think that federalism has played, in three of our policy areas, federalism has played a very important role and continue to play an important role, even as the federal government rolls back its efforts. So I think federalism is an important part of our story and is a critical reason for business support. And basically companies say, if you have a lot of state standards, then we want federal standards because we want uniformity. I think federalism is very important and offers an enormous potential to move forward. Like on appliances, the federal government hasn't regulated appliance, states can continue to do so. They can continue to regulate chemicals. They continue to regulate methane emissions, even if the federal government rolls back standards.
Thank you. Julian, please.
Thanks. I'm just reacting to something you were saying earlier, David, about the abstract nature of climate for consumers
right.
versus public health, for example, which is something much more concrete, or anything that affects their finances. It seems to me that climate change is starting to hit people also very materially in some parts of the US. So we know that, especially there's been quite a bit about insurance. The insurance sector is starting to withdraw from all areas in Florida or California or in other parts of the country because they deem the buildings, whether they are residential or commercial, not insurable anymore. And there's been quite a lot of reporting in the US press about how premiums have skyrocketed in a number of areas, and it's starting to be something that's very materially affecting people in a way that's completely consistent with what climate scientists have taught us. Do you see this as something that may change the dynamics, the dialectics of climate policies in the US at some point, because a threshold is passed, and people talk about food shocks as well as something that might start to be really sensitive? What is your view on this?
Yeah, I think it's possible. I don't think it's happened yet. I don't see it in the foreseeable future. I think, in principle, okay, so my insurance premiums go up. And so what do I do? Which policies do I support? What burdens am I willing to? I'm already paying more for insurance, and you want me to pay more for policies that restrict carbon emissions? That's a tough sell. What am I willing to do okay, my insurance premiums go up. What should I do? What policy should I support? Not obvious.
Yeah.
You want to increase my burdens? You want me to pay more of other things because I have to pay more for insurance? That's a hard sell.
Undoubtedly.
And one aspect that we didn't discuss was the ideological aspect of climate change politics. Much of it is, from one side is at least is kind of ideology against government, and really it's internal politics within the US where, say, the Democrats are pro climate change policies, are more willing to take the burden, more willing to increase government taxing in policies, and the Republicans are not.
Right.
And the way the world goes, if climate change is indeed a problem, and I believe so, a problem that can be tackled and should be tackled by government, and AI and wars. So government is growing anyway, and can we trust our public to take the right decisions? You seems very skeptical of.
Yes, I am. I am very skeptical. I think the public is willing to do things that benefit them or that don't disadvantage them. When something burdens them, I think they draw the line. I think there are real limits. I think there's a lot of support, for example, for renewable energy because people think it's cleaner, it saves money. Okay, so if you can demonstrate climate reduction policies that also provide non-climate benefits, and many of them do, then I think it's viable. Think, for example, of all the Republican-dominated states that have led renewable energy. And they do so not because of ideology, but because of other benefits which they receive. So I think if you can find other benefits, you can triumph over ideology.
That's
the only way you can do it. What?
Yeah, this takes me to your argument from the book on business and politics from the early 80s and maybe the end of the 70s, where you say that willingness to regulate more harshly, business more harshly, is really happening when the economy is doing well.
Right.
And we are doing more and more, we are richer, and the world is richer, right? Maybe we are not as secured, but we are richer compared to the past, compared to our parents. So this
Yeah.
is opening up a place for public sacrifice and willingness to go against big business, no?
Again, I think the public is more willing to sacrifice when they receive direct benefits, like public,
Not when they are richer.
right? When they get, a public or like, for example, their health. Um, yeah, I mean, you make a good point. I still think I think you have to. I think you have to think about it in a little more restrictive ways. Um, I mean, the book focused on business vulnerability, but those policies which I talked about in that book, all really had lots of public benefits to them. And I think,
Consumers.
I think that if they're in public benefits, i.e., non-climate benefits, people are willing to support them.
Yeah.
I think that, and they could, and even to challenge companies. But but I think, again, my sense is, research suggests a pure climate change explicit policy is not the way to go. You have to work behind the backs of the public, and in some ways behind the backs of business.
Yeah.
I think you have to be more modest in your impacts. I think our focus on our book on sectoral policies, for example, or local government policies are important ways to go.
Yeah, it's still this is very American in the sense.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, as I said, we didn't look at other countries.
But I'm thinking with you, not against you, thinking the logic of the state, meaning China investing heavily in batteries and solar
right.
energy, and changing the public benefits and the public calculations. And this doesn't come to your analysis because not because the US government is not changing the calculation, but because of the ethos that the US federal government is not a critical actor in policy
Well,
making.
but I mean, in renewable energy, the United States continues to move forward on renewable energy, on batteries, et cetera. I mean, it's the slower pace because of the cutbacks in federal support, but we continue to move forward on renewable energy. Energy Star is increasingly being expanded to include households and apartments and factories and offices, becoming a de facto property property standard. So I think there are areas in which we continue to make progress. There are many, there are now there are housing developments which are purely electric, which all the appliances are electric. So I think there's, continuing opportunity to move in these areas. I don't think we're suggesting that these are ended. These 6 areas we focus on, each of them which can be strengthened and has been strengthened. So I don't think this is just a story about limits. It's also a story about potential.
And the potential is big enough. How do you kind of measure it against the more ambitious policies?
It's less than it's not as good as them.
It's not as good as them.
But it's better than without them.
Excellent. Thank you so much, David. It was fascinating, and you are the voice of reason and pragmatism that sometimes I'm not that happy to hear, but it's very important to hear. And you have a very original way of thinking about politics in general. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay.
Good day to you all. And
good day. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.